The blade of the shovel was a cold, sharp sound against the frozen earth. Each thrust sent a jarring shock up Elias's arms, a vibration that settled deep in the bones of his shoulders. He worked with a steady, unhurried rhythm, the same rhythm he'd used for chopping wood, for mending fences, for every task that had defined his 19 years. Beside him, a great, shaggy dog with eyes the color of winter dusk sat on its haunches, watching. Barrow did not whine or pace. He simply watched, his head cocked, a silent, furry witness to the seemingly mad endeavor. The air was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of a deeper cold to come. October was bleeding into November, and the mountain was holding its breath. Elias straightened his back, feeling the pull in his lower spine. He looked at the hole he was digging. It was not a hole for a root cellar, nor was it the foundation for a conventional cabin. It was a deep cut into the sloping earth at the base of the Gray Sentinel, a sheer granite cliff face that rose 400 feet into the sky, its face scoured clean by millennia of wind. He was carving a space directly into the lee of the rock, a deliberate burrow. Barrow shifted his weight, his tail giving a single heavy thump against the frosted ground. A voice, rough as granite itself, carried on the wind. "That's a fool's grave you're digging, boy." Silas stood on the ridge above, leaning on a long rifle, his face a road map of wrinkles carved by 70 winters in these mountains. He was the nearest neighbor, a mile down the creek, a man who believed in Proveronimi methods, in cabins built of thick logs with high-peaked roofs to shed the snow, set in the open where the sun could find them. Elias did not look up for long. He just nodded once. "It'll work." "Work for what?" Silas spat a brown stream of tobacco juice that froze almost before it hit the ground. "For the worms to find you easier come spring? You can't build a shelter in the shadow of a rock. The drift will bury you. The damp will rot you from the inside out. Wait until the first real snow. You'll see." Elias drove the shovel back into the earth. The sound was his only reply. He had heard it all before, for the past 3 weeks. First, from Mr. Abernathy, the man who owned the valley, when he'd been given notice to vacate the small tenant farm his parents had worked until the fever took them both last spring. Abernathy had called him stubborn, foolish, a boy with more pride than sense for refusing the offer of a bunk in the logging camp. Then from Mrs. Gable at the general store, who pressed a loaf of bread into his hands with a worried frown, telling him no one winters alone under a cliff. It was a place of ill omen, of falling rock and deep shadows. They did not have his father's journals. They had not seen the sketches, the careful calculations of wind patterns, the notes on thermal mass and the insulating properties of packed earth and snow. His father had been a quiet man, a reader of strange books, a dreamer who had never had the chance to build his dream. He had seen how the wind scoured the base of the Sentinel, leaving a deep pocket of calm even in the worst gales. "The wind is a river," he had written in his spidery hand. "It flows over and around obstacles. The wise man doesn't build a dam, he builds beside the eddy." So Elias dug. He dug until his hands were raw, the blisters turning to calluses that cracked and bled. He would smear them with pine sap at night, the sting a sharp reminder of his purpose. Barrow would lie beside him, licking the wounds with a warm, rough tongue, his presence a steady, comforting weight in the vast emptiness of the coming winter. This was his home now. A hole in the ground, a dog, and a dead man's promise. The hole deepened. It became a trench, then a pit, 12 feet wide and 20 feet long, cut back into the earth until its rear wall was the granite of the cliff itself. He worked until the sun dipped behind the western peaks, and then he worked by the light of a lantern, his shadow a looming giant against the stone. He slept under a canvas lean-to, wrapped in every blanket he owned, with Barrow pressed against his back for warmth. Some nights, the temperature dropped so low the water in his canteen froze solid. He would wake to a world of white frost, his breath pluming in the air, and he would start digging again. He began hauling stones from the creek bed, smooth, heavy river stones the size of bread loaves. He used a crude sledge he'd built from birch poles, dragging them one by one up the slope. His muscles screamed, his body a constant thrum of exhaustion, but the pile of stones grew. He laid the first course for the foundation walls, setting them in a mortar of clay and sand he mixed himself, his fingers numb from the cold mud. The walls rose slowly, 2 feet thick, solid, and uncompromising. He was not just building a shelter, he was building an argument. One afternoon, a wagon rattled up the track. It was Clara, the storekeeper's daughter, her face framed by a woolen scarf. She had brought a sack of flour, a slab of bacon, and a small jar of her mother's preserves. She didn't look at his work with pity or scorn, but with a quiet curiosity. "Mrs. Gable is worried for you," she said, her voice soft. She watched him fit a heavy stone into place. "I'm fine. Silas says you're digging your own tomb." Elias grunted, levering the stone until it sat perfectly flush. He wiped sweat from his brow with the back of a muddy hand, leaving a dark smear on his skin. "Silas has his ideas. I have my father's." Clara looked from the low, thick walls to the towering cliff face. She seemed to see not a grave, but a design. "It's sheltered here," she observed. "The wind doesn't seem to reach." "It goes over," Elias said. It was the most he'd explained his plan to anyone. She nodded, a small, thoughtful gesture. She left the supplies on a clean patch of canvas. "Take care of those hands," she said, her eyes lingering on his raw knuckles. Then she climbed back onto her wagon and was gone, leaving behind the scent of cinnamon and the faint warmth of human kindness. Elias watched her go, then turned back to his wall. He had a plan. He had work to do. Winter was coming. The walls reached a height of 7 feet. Now came the timbers. He felled 10 straight, thick pines from the grove a quarter-mile away, limbing them where they fell. Getting them to the site was a brutal, Herculean task. He used Barrow as an anchor, tying a rope to the dog's harness while he used a system of levers and rollers to inch the massive logs across the uneven ground. Each log was a victory, each movement a testament to stubborn persistence. It took him 2 weeks. His body was honed down to sinew and bone, but his resolve had hardened into something like the granite at his back. He notched the logs with an adze and an axe, his father's drawings spread out on a flat rock, weighed down against the breeze. The crossbeams went up first, spanning the stone walls. Then the ridgepole, a single perfect pine he hoisted into place using an A-frame and a block and tackle, his muscles straining to the point of tearing. Barrow sat and watched, his ears perked, whining softly with a strange, empathetic anxiety as the massive beam swayed precariously before settling into its notches with a solid, satisfying thud. The skeleton of the roof was in place. Across this frame, he laid a tight deck of smaller poles, then covered it with layers of birch bark, peeled in wide sheets and overlapped like shingles to create a waterproof membrane. This was the part that earned him the most ridicule. Mr. Abernathy himself rode out on his fine horse to inspect the boy's folly. "Good God, son," Abernathy said, his voice dripping with condescending authority. He was a thick man, accustomed to being obeyed. "You're putting dirt on your roof? What in heaven's name for? The first heavy rain will turn your house into a mud pit. The weight of the snow will collapse it and crush you flat." Elias was already hauling buckets of earth up a makeshift ramp. "It's a sod roof," he said, not breaking his rhythm. "It's insulation." "It's insanity," Abernathy countered. "I offered you a perfectly good bunk and 3 meals a day. Instead, you choose to live in a hole in the ground with a roof made of dirt. You're a strange boy, Elias, just like your father." He shook his head, a gesture of finality, as if washing his hands of the inevitable tragedy. He spurred his horse and rode away. Elias kept working. He spread a foot-thick layer of the excavated earth over the birch bark, packing it down, seeding it with the tough, fibrous grasses that grew on the tundra. The final layer was the sod itself, cut in thick squares and laid like bricks, the roots interlocking to form a living, breathing shield. His father's journal was clear. A sod roof 2 feet thick had the insulating value of 6 feet of snow. It would hold the warmth from his small stove, and in the summer, it would keep the cabin cool. He built the front wall last, fitting logs between the stone sides. He left a space for a single window and a heavy, low door. The window was his one extravagance, a pane of real glass he'd traded for 3 days of labor, splitting firewood for the blacksmith. He set it carefully, sealing the edges with clay. It faced east to catch the morning sun. The door was made of 3 thick planks of pine, cross-braced and fitted with a wooden latch. It was heavy, solid, a barrier. Inside, the space was small but efficient. The rear wall was the raw, cold granite of the cliff. The floor was packed earth, which he would cover with flat stones later. He built a small, efficient stove out of a metal barrel and river stones, venting it through a clever chimney system his father had designed. The pipe ran horizontally through the stone wall for 10 feet before turning upwards, emerging high on the slope above. The design would preheat the stone mass, radiating warmth back into the room long after the fire died down. It also meant the smoke would be diffuse and less visible, a detail important to a man who valued his privacy. One afternoon, Silas appeared again, this time walking right up to the door. He peered inside, his skeptical gaze taking in the stone walls, the earthen roof, the strange stove. He grunted. "It's a cave. You've built yourself a bear's den." "It's warm," Elias said simply. He had a small fire going, and the interior was already noticeably less cold than the air outside. "Warm with damp," Silas corrected. "You'll be breathing mold by midwinter. And what happens when the snow comes? I told you, the drift off that cliff will be 30 feet deep. It'll cover your door, your window, your chimney. You'll suffocate in your own smoke. You'll starve in the dark." "I have a plan for that," Elias said, his voice quiet. Silas snorted. "A plan. The mountain doesn't care about a boy's plans." He turned and left, shaking his head. Elias's plan was another detail from the journals. Beside the door, he drove a series of tall, thin birch poles deep into the ground, standing 10 feet high. They were spaced 3 feet apart, forming a line that extended 20 feet out from the cabin. They looked like skeletal sentinels. To anyone else, they were meaningless. To Elias, they were depth gauges. They were his early warning system. He spent the last weeks of autumn laying in supplies. He hunted, bringing down a deer and smoking the meat. He fished the creek until it began to ice over. He gathered firewood, stacking it in a massive, neat pile that filled the space between the cabin's side wall and the cliff face, creating another layer of insulation. He hauled sacks of oats for himself and dried fish for Barrow. The cabin was small, but it was a fortress of preparedness. Everything had a place. Every object served a purpose. By the first week of December, the world had turned to iron. The ground was frozen solid. The trees were bare, skeletal fingers clawing at a pewter sky. The first snows came, light dustings that outlined the world in white. Elias felt the change in pressure, the deep, resonant silence that preceded a real storm. Barrow was restless, whining softly in his sleep and pacing the small cabin, his nose pressed to the crack under the door. The wind began to pick up, a low moan that grew into a keening shriek as it hit the high peaks. It started in the afternoon, not with gentle flakes, but with a sudden, violent onslaught, a horizontal wall of white that erased the world. The temperature plummeted. Elias checked his thermometer, 10 below zero, then 20. The wind hammered at the small cabin, but it was a deflected blow. He could hear it screaming high overhead, a furious, impotent rage, but inside his shelter, the air was still. The little stove glowed with a steady orange warmth. Barrow lay curled by the fire, finally calm. Elias sat at his small table, mending a tear in his coat by the light of a tallow lamp, the sounds of the storm a distant, irrelevant roar. He was warm, he was dry, he was safe. His father had been right. For 2 days the world was nothing but the storm. The wind never ceased its assault, and the snow piled in drifts of impossible size. Through his single window, Elias watched the world disappear. The snow rose past the bottom of the pane, then the middle, then the top, plunging the cabin into a dim, perpetual twilight. The birch poles he had planted vanished one by one, markers of the rising tide. First the 5-foot mark, then 7, then the 10-foot tops were swallowed by the churning white. Silas had been right about the depth of the drift. He had just been wrong about its effect. Inside the cabin, life continued in a calm, quiet rhythm. Elias ate his smoked venison and oat porridge. He carved a small wooden bird, the shavings piling up on the stone floor. He read his father's journals again, not for instruction now, but for company. Barrow slept, ate, and occasionally nudged Elias's hand for a reassuring scratch behind the ears. The temperature inside never dropped below 50 degrees. The thick sod roof, now buried under a dozen feet of insulating snow, held the heat perfectly. The stone walls and granite cliff face radiated a gentle, constant warmth from the stove. It was not a tomb, it was a womb. On the 3rd day, the sound of the wind changed. It was no longer a high-pitched scream, but a low, guttural growl. And with it came a new sound, a sharp, cracking report like a rifle shot, followed by a deep groan. It happened again and again. Trees, heavy with ice and snow, battered by winds exceeding 100 miles an hour, were surrendering. He thought of the town, of the log cabins with their high-peaked roofs. Roofs designed to shed snow, but not this weight, not this wind. He thought of Silas in his cabin by the creek, of Clara and her family in the apartment above the store. A cold knot of worry tightened in his stomach. His own shelter was secure. The weight on his roof was immense, but it was distributed across the thick timbers and supported by the unyielding stone walls and the mountain itself. The structure groaned under the load, the timbers creaking like a ship at sea, but it held. It was designed to hold. Late on the 4th day, the wind began to subside. The silence that followed was profound, absolute. Elias knew he had to dig out, but not yet. He waited another full day, letting the snowpack settle. When he finally unlatched his door, it wouldn't budge. A solid wall of snow pressed against it. This, too, his father had foreseen. He went to the back of the cabin, to the granite wall. Tucked away behind the woodpile was a small, low opening, sealed with a tight-fitting stone plug. It was a tunnel, just wide enough for a man to crawl through. He had dug it in secret, a month before, a narrow shaft that angled upward for 15 feet, emerging on the slope high above where the wind would have scoured the snow, not deposited it. His escape hatch, his breathing hole. He pulled on his heaviest clothes, grabbed his shovel, and squeezed into the tunnel, pushing the tool ahead of him. Barrow whined, distressed at being left behind. "I'll be back," Elias said, his voice echoing in the confined space. The crawl was tight and claustrophobic, the air thick with the smell of cold earth. He emerged into a strange, transformed world. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue. The sun glared off a landscape of pure white, sculpted by the wind into fantastic shapes, waves and crests and deep, shadowed valleys. The entire valley was buried. Only the very tops of the tallest pines were visible, their branches shattered. Of the town, there was no sign. Just a vast, undulating blanket of white. The snow in the valley was 20 feet deep, in places deeper. His own cabin was completely invisible, a mere bump in a monstrous drift that swept up the face of the gray sentinel. He began the grueling work of digging down to his own front door. He had to clear a trench, a deep canyon in the snow, heaving shovel after shovel of the heavy, compacted powder. It took him 4 hours. When he finally cleared the door and swung it open, Barrow rushed out, barking with joy and relief, plowing through the fresh snow. The air was still and brutally cold. Elias stood in the trench, looking out at the buried world. He was alone, but he was alive. He had food, he had warmth, he had shelter, he had survived. The question was, had anyone else? He packed a small bag with dried meat, a flask of water, and a small medical kit. He strapped on the snowshoes he had made himself from ash wood and rawhide. He gave Barrow a command to stay, and the dog, sensing the gravity in his tone, sat reluctantly by the open cabin door. Then Elias began to walk toward the place where the town should be. The journey was a nightmare. The snow was deep and treacherous, with soft spots where he sank to his chest and hard, wind-scoured crusts that were slick as ice. It took him 2 hours to travel a distance he could normally walk in 20 minutes. As he drew closer, the devastation became apparent. A roof, ripped clean from its walls, lay half-buried like the wing of a fallen bird. The steeple of the small church was gone, snapped off like a twig. He came first to Silas's cabin, or what was left of it. The creek had frozen, then flooded, and the subsequent blizzard had entombed the small building in a mountain of ice and snow. The roof had collapsed inward under the weight. There was no sign of life. Elias called out Silas's name, his voice swallowed by the immense silence. There was no answer. He felt a pang of genuine sorrow for the old man, for his certainty, for his stubborn refusal to see another way. He pressed on toward the town center. The general store was a ruin. The entire front wall had been blown in, and the interior was a chaotic mess of snow, splintered wood, and scattered goods. He saw a movement in the wreckage of the second floor. It was Clara, her face pale and smudged with soot. She was trying to free her father, whose leg was pinned beneath a heavy beam. Her mother was huddled in a corner, wrapped in a quilt, shivering violently. "Elias!" Clara's voice was a croak of disbelief and desperate hope. He didn't waste words. He scrambled over the debris and assessed the situation. The beam was immense. He couldn't lift it alone. He used his shovel as a lever, wedging it under the beam and using a block of wood as a fulcrum. "On 3, he told Clara. "Push up with all you have." He put his entire body into it, the muscles in his back and legs screaming in protest. The beam lifted, just an inch, just enough. Clara dragged her father free. The man's leg was broken, a shard of bone visible through the torn fabric of his trousers. He was barely conscious. "We can't stay here," Elias said, his breath pluming. "We'll freeze." "Where can we go?" Clara's mother whispered, her eyes wide with shock. "Everything is destroyed." "My cabin," Elias said. "It's safe. It's warm." He splinted the man's leg using 2 pieces of a broken chair and strips of cloth, then began the impossible task of getting them back to his shelter. He fashioned a makeshift sledge from a tabletop and rope. Getting the injured man onto it was a struggle. The journey back was even worse than his trip out. He and Clara pulled, slipping and sliding, falling into drifts, their lungs burning from the frigid air. Mrs. Gable followed, stumbling, her face a mask of numb despair. They arrived at the trench leading to his cabin as dusk was falling, painting the snow in shades of purple and gray. When they saw the low, solid door, the wisp of smoke curling from the hidden chimney, the steady golden light from the window, their expressions shifted from despair to awe. It was a burrow, a den, a hole in the ground, and it was the most beautiful thing they had ever seen. Inside, the warmth enveloped them like a blanket. Barrow greeted them with low whines and licks of the hand. Elias settled the injured man near the stove, covering him with his own blankets. He gave them hot tea made from melted snow and bowls of warm porridge. They ate in silence, the simple act of consuming warm food in a safe place a miracle. Clara looked around the small, efficient space. The smooth stone walls, the solid timbers overhead, the warm glow of the stove. "You were right," she said, her voice soft with wonder. "Everyone said you were a fool, but you were right." Elias just nodded, adding another log to the stove. The fire crackled. It was a sound of life. The next day he went out again. He found other survivors. The Abernathy family was huddled in their root cellar, the main house above them a pile of kindling. Mr. Abernathy, the man of wealth and authority, looked broken. His fine clothes were torn, his face haggard. He had lost everything. When Elias offered him shelter, the man could only nod, his pride shattered. He and his wife and 2 small children followed Elias back through the snow, their faces a mixture of shame and profound gratitude. He rescued 12 people in all. His small cabin became a crowded sanctuary. People slept on the floor, huddled together for warmth and comfort. He shared his food, his water, his space without question. He tended to their wounds, from frostbite to the deep gash on a logger's arm, cleaning them with boiled water and bandaging them with torn sheets. He was no longer the strange boy, the outcast. He was their savior. In the evenings, crammed into the small, warm space, they would talk. Mr. Abernathy, his voice humbled, asked him how he had known. "My father," Elias said, and for the first time, he brought out the worn, leather-bound journals. He showed them the drawings, the calculations, the observations on wind and snow and the power of the earth. He explained the principles of the sod roof, the thermal mass of the cliff, the design of the chimney. He wasn't boasting, he was teaching. They listened, no longer with skepticism, but with the rapt attention of students who had survived a brutal lesson. Silas, it turned out, had survived. Elias found him on the 5th day, holed up in a hollowed-out snowdrift, his cabin utterly destroyed. The old trapper had a bad case of frostbite on his feet and was weak from hunger. Elias brought him back to the cabin. When Silas saw the crowd of people, warm and safe inside the structure he had called a fool's grave, he just stared. Later that night, as Elias was changing the dressing on his blackened toes, the old man spoke, his voice raspy. "I was wrong, boy," he said, not looking at him. "I'm sorry. You saved us." "My father's plan saved us," Elias corrected quietly. "No," Silas insisted, finally meeting his eyes. "A plan is just paper. You did the work. You built it." It was the highest praise Elias had ever received. When the thaw finally came weeks later, it revealed a valley scarred beyond recognition. The town was gone, but its people were not. Led by Elias, they began to rebuild. But they did not build the same way. They built into the hillsides, using the earth for shelter. They built with thick stone walls and low sod roofs. They used his father's journals as their blueprints. Mr. Abernathy, having lost his fortune but gained a measure of wisdom, funded the materials for the whole community, working alongside the others, his hands growing calloused for the first time in his life. Elias never sought a leadership role, but it was given to him. He was the one they consulted, the one they watched. He spoke little, but when he did, people listened. He showed them how to read the wind, how to understand the snow, how to build a home that did not fight the mountain, but worked with it. He shared his knowledge freely, and the valley was reborn, stronger and wiser than before. Years passed. The new town, which they called Sentinel, thrived. The houses were strange to an outsider's eye, nestled into the earth, their green roofs blending with the landscape. But they were warm in the winter and cool in the summer, and when the great winds blew, they held fast. Elias married Clara. They built a small addition to the cabin under the cliff, a new room dug even deeper into the earth. They lived a quiet life. He never lost his love for working with his hands, for the simple, honest feel of wood and stone. She became the town's teacher, sharing not just books, but the stories of the great blizzard, of the foolishness of pride, and the wisdom of a quiet boy who listened to his father. Barrow grew old. His muzzle turned gray, his steps became slow. One summer evening, he lay down by the fire, put his head on Elias's lap, and went to sleep. He did not wake up. Elias buried him on the slope above the cabin, under a tall pine tree, and marked the spot with a simple, smooth river stone. He mourned his friend with a quiet, profound grief, for the dog had been his first and most faithful believer. The decades rolled on. Elias's hair turned the color of snow. His hands became gnarled, but they were still strong. He saw children born in the homes he had helped design, children who grew up knowing the stories of the storm. They looked at him with a kind of reverence, this quiet, legendary man who had saved their grandparents. He and Clara grew old together, their love a quiet, steady thing like the pilot light in a stove. She passed away in her sleep one spring, and he buried her beside Barrow, under the same tall pine. He lived on for another 5 years, a fixture in the valley he had reshaped. He spent his days sitting on the bench outside his cabin, the first one, the one that had started it all. He would watch the wind moving through the grasses on the sod roofs of the town below, a quiet satisfaction in his pale blue eyes. He had done good work. He had honored his father. He had built a home. When he died, the entire valley mourned. They buried him on the slope with Clara and Barrow, overlooking the town he had saved. They carved a simple epitaph into a large piece of granite they moved to the site. It did not list dates or accomplishments. It said only, Elias Thorne. He listened to the mountain. He built a home. The cabin under the cliff was never lived in again. The town preserved it as a monument, a reminder. The wild grasses grew thick on its roof. The pine door weathered to a silver gray. The single glass window pane still caught the morning sun, sending a spear of golden light into the quiet, empty dark. It stood against the wind and the snow, season after season, a silent testament to a quiet man's conviction, a structure of stone and sod and stubborn hope. It was not a grave, it was a foundation.